When we talk about learning Chinese, we have to separate two things. Someone can speak Chinese, even speak it really well, and that's one thing. Being able to read and write Chinese is a completely different thing. In my previous video, I shared my own view. Chinese is a symbol-based language, and that's where it feels different. And to be honest, when I learn Japanese, I see some people learning Japanese but choosing not to learn kanji. And I get it. Everyone's goals are different. So some people only want to understand and speak, and that's enough. In this video, I will talk about ways Chinese can feel easier, like learning through radicals or using association to remember characters. But I want to say this again. Chinese still follows a rule that applies to every language. Linguists call it comprehensible input.
Probably the best kept secret in the profession. We acquire language in one way and only one way, when we understand messages. We call this comprehensible input. We acquire language when we understand what people tell us, not how they say it, but what they say, or when we understand what we read.
Chinese is included. It's not some special exception. No, I didn't mean that. Every language learning process goes through one unavoidable step. You have to reach the point where you can understand what you hear. If you don't understand, your attention cannot stay. We often call it memory, understanding. But I prefer to say it this way. Whatever you pay attention to, that's what you end up remembering. Language without writing exists everywhere in China. In China, there are many languages and dialects that don't have a writing system. The dialect from where I was born didn't have Chinese characters. My grandma, she cannot read, she cannot write, but she has language. And that explains something important. Culture is carried by characters, but everyday communication among ordinary people is carried by words. And words don't have to have characters. Words are built on sound. Writing exists because people need to communicate when they cannot talk face to face. But in a village, most people know each other. Talking is easy, so there is less need for writing and no need for it to develop. Early writing didn't come from daily conversations among farmers. It started in formal spaces like rituals, ceremonies, sacrifices, to communicate with God. Later, it served the needs of rulers, emperors, and kings. It was top-down, not bottom-up. In an industrial society, people move into cities for work. There is no familiar faces, and their local dialect doesn't work anymore, so they rely on Mandarin to communicate. Many people who only spoke dialects slowly learn Mandarin in the city, but they still cannot write characters, and PE is even further away. PE is something we learn in school, especially after the founding of the People's Republic of China, to promote Mandarin. I learned Pinyin, my father learned Zhuyin, like this. For me, that system feels unfamiliar and confusing because I never learned it. And you will notice something. A lot of older Chinese people prefer voice messages. They send voice messages to their grandson, granddaughter. One reason is cultural. People raised in rural life often prefer listening to sound rather than reading text because they never needed text for daily communication. And they only speak dialect. If they communicate with their grandson, they cannot find characters. So with voice messages, it's convenient. Another reason is simple. Some people are illiterate, so voice is the only option. That's also why Chinese input methods have a handwriting option. It's super convenient for people who cannot use pinyin but can write characters. For older generations, like grandpa's generation, it's perfect. They don't need to know how to pronounce it. They just need to know how to write it, and their communication works. Chinese can be learned in ways that feel much simpler. First, if you only want listening and speaking, and you don't care about reading and writing, then you can ignore the whole Chinese as a symbol system strategy. You can learn it like any other language. People who are naturally strong in listening and speaking really can reach, understand, plus speak well in a short time. It's not surprising those people exist. Before I was 5, I also learned a language that had no writing system. I couldn't read or write it, but I could communicate. My daily life was fine. I got information through sound, no problem at all. But if you are learning Chinese characters, then here is the key. Now we are talking about learning Hanzi. It's like learning French. You have er verbs, er verbs, and irregular verbs. There are categories. In modern Chinese, we have radicals, and you can learn them with the similar logic. For example, characters with 月, which means the moon, radical, are often related to body and flesh, 长, 胖, 腰. Characters with 木, which means wood, often related to trees and wood, 树, 林, 森. Characters with 走之旁, often relate to movement or distance, 运动, 遥远. Then there is another method that works extremely well. Don't learn characters as isolated pieces, learn them in categories. Take the categories you know and build them into words. Don't learn them scattered. This is something school does well. It turns messy information into patterns. For example, 肉 means meat. Add any animal and it's instantly clear. 猪肉, 牛肉, 鸡肉, 羊肉. Animal plus 肉, it works. Then months. English and French have totally different words, but Chinese is just number plus 月, months. 1月, 2月, 3月, 4月, 5月. And Japanese is the same logic. And then types of trees, attribute plus 树, 杨树, 柳树, 枇杷树, 榴莲树, 无花果树. You can do this forever. For example, then means man, 男人, 女人, 年轻人, 老年人, 美国人, 法国人, 中国人. And here's the moment it clicks. Once your ears start noticing how logical Chinese is, you can suddenly feel Chinese is actually simple, and something that felt hard becomes easier in 1 second. Anthropologists and linguists are good at finding patterns. Teachers do the same thing. They help us pull order out of chaos and turn it into a system. Chinese is also a system. In my previous video, I said Chinese has a special side. It can communicate through symbol system but doesn't rely on sound. And those symbols have lasted thousands of years with only such changes. That's kind of unbelievable. And why is Chinese so concise? Why so many 4-character idioms? Environment. In ancient China, most people were ordinary. People who could study were usually better off, and writing circulated among upper classes. So if you wanted information to travel far, you needed it to be short, tight, easy to pass on. Otherwise, the longer it gets, the more it changes as people repeat it. In many forms of Chinese, you say this. 4-character idioms are catchy, often rhythmic, easy to spread. So if you want to learn Chinese characters, the 2 big methods are: first, radicals. Second, categorizing and grouping words. This also reflects a Chinese mindset. We like to put things into categories, so complex things become simple and more organized. That's a feature of Chinese. Chinese people value order and harmony. Things aren't just thrown around randomly. There is a proper place. And Hanzi is the same. Neat, structured, stroke by stroke. And yes, it also shows why we struggle with English sometimes. English doesn't always feel as patterned, but it's rich and flexible in expression, so it becomes harder in a different way. Finally, here are some category word examples for you, just as references. 画，国画、油画，山水画、风景画、人物画，房，楼房、平房、茅草房，猫，布偶猫、狸花猫、橘猫，路，山路，高速路，水泥路、土路，语，母语、英语、法语、鸟语，床，席梦思床、婴儿床。There are way too many. These are just a few examples to get your brain into the pattern.